Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to Simone and Patrice, and especially thank you to Bernard and Caroline and Elsa and Augustin for allowing us all to invade and welcoming the invasion with such hospitality. 35 years ago, a book was published in the United States called A Cinema of Loneliness, that attempted to think about a series of modern filmmakers whose works resist the Hollywood commitment to wholeness, belonging, and happy endings. Filmmakers who leave their viewers lonely with reality and deploy images of loneliness and entrapment, isolation and fear to reinforce that desperate perception we have of ourselves. That's a quote. Cinema as the exposure of disindividuation. But maybe this is not just a question of reinforcement of the release of repressed contents via the traumatic typical images and scenes of a cinema resistive of stereotypical conventionality. And it strikes me that we can rename stereotype and trauma type as respectively trope and entrope. For Stanley Cavell, there is a sense in which cinema has itself become this prison, because it conditions us to be essentially alone and separated from the whole world that is the world of the film itself. Our condition has become one in which our natural mode of perception is to view, feeling unseen. We do not so much look at the world as look out at it, from behind the self. It is our fantasies, now all but completely thwarted and out of hand, which are unseen and must be kept unseen, as if we could no longer hope that anyone might share them. At just the moment that they are pouring into the streets, less private than ever, so we are less than ever in a position to marry them to the world. Cavell here describes, in ambiguous counterfactual fashion, a loss of hope that connects our inability to tie our desire to the world to the condition given to us by cinema as such, a condition that would be cinema's automatism, and the chapter of the book that quotation was from is called Automatisms. Cinema remakes the world viewed such that we, situated outside the screen we are watching, are thereby divorced from the world. We could furthermore construe this as a hypothesis about the popularity or the populism of movies that stage for us the fantasy of the end of the world, of being the last generation, or one of the last, of seeing the end right before our very eyes. In this apocalypticism, the 21st century is still the century of cinema, now more than ever. The century of the ubiquitous screen makes Cavell's diagnosis of our condition seem prescient. Everyone is perpetually before a screen that gives them the whole world, that supplies, feeds, distorts, and exploits every dream and every fantasy, but which is also for us literally a screen, behind which we can hide, unseen, masked, and behind which, therefore, we need not exist for this world, where our cares and desires do not have to matter to this world, with which they do not have to marry. But a desire we need never marry to the world is one that requires of us no investment. And desire without investment is not just thwarted, but short-circuited. If the screen does not inherently mask us and our desire from the world, it is nevertheless a tendency of the ubiquitous screen to disentangle our desire from the desires of others, which it does by combining with a system that systematically depletes desire in a way that reduces its exclamatory character to solipsism, but so as to intensify the solus while eliminating the ipse. This is one basis of the carelessness that means a whole generation can be left abandoned by the previous one. But if it is true that what was a proliferation of screens can now be accurately characterized as a ubiquity, then it becomes possible for this abandonment this entanglement of the generations, to reach an ultimate point of disconnection that can indeed be understood as the end of generations as such. Skip the next paragraph. Hence, if to think in the Anthropocene is to receive the shock of this pharmacology as such, then in an age when the world is overwhelmingly encountered through the mediation of this dark lens, the conditions of the experience of this shock are themselves techno-aesthetic. To think in the Anthropocene therefore inevitably involves thinking the techno-aesthetics of shock itself. The argument presented here is that this means thinking the digital turn both as a mutation amounting to a fundamental rupture with the audio-visual hegemony of the analog mnemotechnical system, and as an intensification of the hegemony of ultra-rapid audio-visual technology unfolding in unpredictable ways. Okay. Aesthetics in its classical phase, which despite everything is probably still the dominant, if not always explicit, mode of aesthetic reflection, understands the aesthetic idea, the faculty of presentation of which is spirit understood as animating principle, as indeterminate, so that it sets the faculty of intellectual ideas, reason, into motion, aesthetically enlarges the concept itself, and as such gives more to think about than can be grasped and made distinct. In this, the indeterminateness of the aesthetic idea is a gift beyond calculability, hence the sublime is thought as bearer of the idea of infinity, but lacking the category of consistence, this becomes a question of the play of the representable and the unrepresentable, and gets caught in the aporias of imagination and unrepresentability. Nevertheless, the two thoughts of indeterminateness and infinity beyond calculation are the engine of the two questions animating this aesthetic understanding. If aesthetic ideas are indeterminate, on what basis can different individuals hold these ideas in common or make decisions concerning their relative merits? And if they gesture to an infinity beyond calculation, then what can be the significance of this infinity for the universe as a whole and for the rational beings that we hope to be, for whom this infinity functions as a challenge to think beyond our limits? The first of these questions, that of the socialization and collectivization of aesthetic ideas, is not in this classical period thought in terms of process. The question of what process mediates between the individual and the collective does not arise, and there is instead a resort to the assumption of shared, pre-existing cognitive capacities. The second of these questions could be spelled otherwise as referring to something like the cosmological significance of sublimity. But without an understanding that this generation of the infinite is a question not just of the aesthetic play of imagination and the understanding, but instead has techno-aesthetic or phenomeno-techno-aesthetic conditions, the answer to this question gets caught in aporias of nature. The human being, in its transcendent appreciation of nature, becomes a kind of nature, the nature of the human being to seek nature's purposiveness beyond nature itself. And because this ultimate purposiveness is understood as that of rational human being, grasped as the nature of nature, it is inconceivable to such a way of thinking that this purposiveness could ultimately become a source of misery, of the immiseration not just of humankind, but of nature itself. Both questions are thus impeded from thinking the temporality of aesthetic processes by the repression of any consideration of the aesthetic artifact as such. Despite the many and varied peregrinations of 19th century aesthetic philosophy, perhaps it is only with the Anthropology of Marcel Mauss that a step beyond the metaphysical opposition of the material and the spiritual lying at the basis of this repression becomes truly possible. Mauss takes this step, if we can say this, by deconstructing the opposition between non-rational spiritual gift exchange and rational material economic exchange, by thinking more or less what is older than this opposition. To think beyond the idea that the former is grounded in the rational calculation of self-interested individuals about material interests, and the latter in collective immaterial considerations, means for most thinking the spirituality of the material object itself, the how of the Taonga, this relating as well to Malinowski's description of the cooler ring, which is exactly 100 years ago that he was in the Trobriand Islands, as a question both of material objects and of common understandings. And where the anthropologist's question with respect to the cooler ring, what is the motivating energy behind these dangerous journeys of hundreds of miles just to exchange shell necklaces and armbands, could very much be applied in just the same way to the journeys undertaken to arrive at a ritual event, noetic and aesthetic, such as this gathering here this week, with answers not all that different. Since this exchange economy involves all aspects of the total social fact, morality, values, obligations, the knowledge of how to do and live, the prism of gift and counter-gift becomes the mechanism through which to understand all material symbolic phenomena, that is, aesthetic, sensational, exclamatory phenomena. And because this is a question of thinking beyond the opposition of interested calculation and disinterested exchange, it becomes a pharmacological consideration of the duplicity of the gift. For Lévi-Strauss, the problem with the Mosian account of giving, receiving, returning is the question of how these elements are bound together. How? By applying to the isolated parts, which are the only present elements, a source of energy which can synthesize them. But this is where the difficulty comes in. Does this property exist objectively, like a physical property of the exchanged goods? Obviously not. Here, even if, for Lévi-Strauss, the solution to this problem of the insufficient objectivity of this source of energy is to refer to Moses' earlier essay on magic in order to appeal to the notion that the unity of the whole is even more real than each of the parts. And even if Lévi-Strauss is here still concerned with the question of how the synchronic marries with the diachronic, nevertheless, the resort to deciding metaphysically between the subjectivity or objectivity of this energy is the very means by which structural anthropology comes to be set up. By deciding that this energy, the energy that is the spirituality of the how of the material Taonga, is merely an additional quantity added by most to bind the parts of exchange into a whole, structuralism is founded on a kind of evisceration, an evacuation of the energy animating processes. In this way, structural anthropology is premised on the basis of the removal of organs as organs. How does this early dismissal of the question of energy and of the materiality of energy, binding the processes investigated by Mosian anthropology, bear upon the conclusion 5 years later that the energetic character of the activities of the mortal subjects of anthropology is purely negative, that is, entropic? However that stands, Georges Bataille's general economy derives precisely from taking as a starting point what Lévi-Strauss dismisses out of hand, the energy of the process. And this has something to do with why, even if Bataille makes too much of the distinction between homo faber and homo ludens, he is not wrong to conclude, in relation to the birth of art, that is, the creation of this world of art in which communication between individual minds begins, that is, the birth of collective individuation as coinciding with the birth of techno-aesthetic mediation, that authentic transgression, that is, committed not out of indifference but knowingly, is not just anomalous with respect to the inherent conservatism of the economy of gift and counter-gift. Desire and spirit overflows the world of work and exceeds the spirit of the prohibitions indispensable to safeguarding this world, and this is originary with respect to the energetic character of work itself, as that which opens the circuit of gift and counter-gift. In other words, Bataille recognizes that if art is the clearest expression of the gift economy, that is the libidinal economy, as an organization of sublimation, and specifically of the sublimation of the savage, then this fact contains a terrible and pharmacological ambiguity. But if this could be understood as a general economy of libidinal energy, nevertheless, despite the Nietzschean provenance of this genealogy, it is not yet grasped in Bataille as a question of the transductive becoming of organs, the engine of which has long been the unfolding of the process of grammatization, a process the origin of which coincides with the birth of art. Only in a general organology does this explicitly become a question of starting from an analysis of the process of hominization, and on that basis understanding the economy of gift and countergift as the generation of sensational exclamatory circuits composing material, symbolic, libidinal and political economies derived from the becoming of psychic, collective and technical organs. Skip the next paragraph. It is now, on the one hand, a question of reinterpreting the questions of entropy and negentropy on the basis of general organology, from the recognition that the question of entropy arises from the advent of the techniques of combustion, which is to say that this technological advance was a challenge to the perception of the equilibrium of the universe so that it became a cosmos in becoming, and that entropy is inherently a question of the distinction between available and unavailable energy in a way that Georgescu-Roegen described as essentially anthropomorphic, yet also exosomatic, so that the anthropos cannot be divorced from the instruments by which this energy is available or otherwise, and that this question of instruments implies a question of the concretization of systems, that is, that the evaluation of the negentropy of a system is always a local consideration within the overall cosmological entropic tendency, which is why techniques can always be both an accentuation of negentropy and an increase of entropy, and that the question of energy is in some way generalizable beyond the definition of physical energy, where energy is then in general what can cause movement or change or transformation and what can be saved or spent. Even if it is possible that these energies can still be understood beyond any reducibility to physics as conforming to the notion of energy as the capacity of a system to perform work, and that the question of negentropy as the question of the struggle for the persistence and proliferation of order and differentiation must be thought on the basis of difference as the problem of this persistence understood inscriptively, but less quasi-transcendentally than quasi-causally. From all this, it follows that entropy and negentropy must be understood as essentially organological concepts. All energy that is available for us is organological energy. But, on the other hand, there is a sense in which this is also a question of deepening general organology by situating it more firmly within this reinterpreted problematic of entropy and negentropy. All the economic processes governing the relations between the strands of psychic, collective and technical individuation must not only be thought as situated within the context of the overall vital individuation process, in turn situated within the processes of geological and planetary becoming, determining the milieu of this vital individuation process, a process that within the multitudinous transformational effects wrought by the energy made available by the discovery of combustion becomes a techno-geological process, which is why we refer to the Anthropocene, but must also be understood as essentially energetic processes of physical, libidinal and noetic energy, where energy is a concept that is quasi-causally and differentially inflected. The pharmacological then becomes comprehensible as the expression of the quasi-causal neganthropological struggle of technical life. Skip the next paragraph. Okay. The contemporary techno-aesthetic epoch can be characterized by the absorption of the previous techno-aesthetic epochs of the textual and the analog into the digital. To absorb a process is to take it over and into a larger, more general process. But it is not necessarily to destroy this process, even if it is thereby transformed. What does that mean in this case? Textual, analog, and digital nemotechnologies all constitute epochs of the overall process of grammatization. But insofar as grammatization begins with the birth of art exemplified by prehistoric cave painting, it precedes the processes and systems opened up by the technologies not only of printing, radio, cinema, television, and computing, but also of writing understood in the narrow sense. The epoch of grammatization, as the epoch of the différance of différence, is then the opening of the age of the exclamatory, the sensational, the symbolic, and therefore the noetic, because it is the opening of the techno-aesthetic as the possibility of the socialization of desire and affect. And if this birth of art is then the birth of archae cinema before the birth of archae writing, then the process of grammatization is in a way cinematic before it is textual. Even if the interpretive practice on which cinema in the strict sense is founded is nevertheless conditional upon the composition of the cinematic and the textual made possible by the invention of writing. The absorption of textual and analog technologies into the extremely general grammatization process that is the digital turn is then a chapter of a process that was always already cinematic before being textual. That is, the energy of which initially stems from the power derived by combining light, fire, inscription, and temporality, all initially animated or negantropized by the solar expenditure. The advent of the cinematic age, strictly speaking, begins with precisely the arrival of a steam train as recorded by the Lumiere brothers. A steam train that we could say departed, which is to say first arrived 100 years earlier. The first working model of a steam locomotive having been constructed in 1794, the same year that Kant published The End of All Things, in which he wonders why it is that human beings expect an end of the world at all, that is, that a time will arrive in which all alteration ceases. The whole of nature will be rigid and, as it were, petrified, and against which thinking would be, he says, a reflection that can occur only in time. Hence, in 1895, was inaugurated the Entropic Age of the Anthropocene, but if this is the question of the opening of a new cosmology, it remains significant that the movement of this arrival is first shown to us in 1895. An exhibition the purported shock of which for contemporary audiences is legendary, if not mythological. It is this combination of the thermodynamic event and the cinematic event that exposes the arrow of time. This was consolidated in a paradoxical way in another 1895 Lumiere film, Demolition of a Wall, the contents of which are eponymously described, except that when it was exhibited after the collapse of the wall, the projector was reversed so that the wall is magically and fantastically rebuilt from rubble. Before the distinction between documentary and fiction, this representation of the apparent impossibility of reversing thermodynamic temporality, as Georgescu-Roegen points out, mechanical reversibility means spectators would not have been able to tell if the reversed movie had instead showed a swinging pendulum, exposes entropy and exposes it to the impossible or to the exceedingly improbable. But it is an exposure based on the chemical interaction of light and film that really touch, which is why Bazin says, in reflecting on the process of cinematic unfolding that led from the arrival of a train to a voyage to the moon, that the fantastic in cinema is possible only because of the irresistible realism of the photographic image, that is, of the analog photographic image. The most anthropocenic of all movies is perhaps Monty Hellman's Two-Lane Blacktop, released in 1971, the same year in which Cavell published The Worldview that describes the cinematic automatisms thwarting our individual and collective fantasies. This loneliest of cinemas depicts characters who have lost the ability to communicate about anything except cars and lost the ability to do anything except drive nowhere, in a country that seems empty of everything except roads and gas stations. Two-Lane Blacktop ends, famously, with an interior shot from behind the driver inside a vehicle racing down a deserted airstrip. First the sound disappears, then the film slows until the frame-by-frame movement becomes clearly perceptible, before the image finally freezes, as though the film has become caught in the projector. The light of the imaginary incandescent bulb then melting and burning through the celluloid. Ending the film and leaving the audience to wonder if this is also a symbolic representation of the crashing and burning of the vehicle itself along with its driver, not shown explicitly, perhaps because our apprehension of the mortality of the characters depends only on cinematic means, and so it is the entropy of the cinematic process itself, not just of its human actors, and by extension the entropy of the cinematic civilization, that is also the civilization of the automobile, the Anthropocene itself, that is burning before us, that is being reduced to the unavailable energy that is ashes. Cinema was then, from the beginning, a correspondence of technology and magic, that is, the expression of the fantastic, emerging from, exhibiting and exposing the era of thermodynamics and petrochemicals. It has never left this era behind, which is perhaps why it was possible, for example, to construct a graph of the cinematic output of the most entropic of all Hollywood directors, Michael Bay, correlating the profits of his various blockbusters with the number of explosions each one contains. This correlation is impressively linear, running from a profit of $141 million extracted from the measly 18 explosions in Bad Boys to a profit of $1.1 billion for Transformers 3, which contains a reported 283 explosions. And the progressively greater number of moments of entropic explosiveness in his films makes it seem that Bay is increasingly conscious of this correlation, which thus becomes an important aesthetic idea determining his inartistic insensibility. Between the thermodynamic technology of combustive entropy and negentropy and the digital technology of informational entropy lies the libidinal entropy of audiovisual technology. It is a question then of three kinds of energy, each irreducible to the other. Vital individuation as the struggle to maintain the availability of physical energy, psychosocial individuation as the struggle to maintain the availability of libidinal energy and physical energy, a struggle that in the 20th century was ultimately conducted against the televisual industry devoted to the capture of this energy, where to capture means precisely to make unavailable by capturing available brain time, and where this means the libidinal brain, in order to organize an entropic behavioralist performativity attempting to control desire and decision in the service of consumerism. And in the digital age, the focus turns to noetic individuation as the struggle to maintain the availability of the energy of rational knowledge. If the digital turn can indeed be described as a transformation of the technical system in which it is now noetic energy that is at stake, this is because, in addition to the capture of available brain time, that is libidinal energy, it is now a question of a computational power that, because it processes, that is, orders and reorders information more quickly than human beings, tends increasingly to be regarded as rendering the informational ordering capacities of the noetic soul obsolescent, that is, a matter of indifference. Operating more quickly than our capacity for comprehension, the high-speed ordering of information is understood on this view, not in terms of the possibility of disordering knowledge, but only in terms of the purported decreasing relevance of the noeticity of either decision or value, in turn making possible the practical and ideological organization of a so-called data behaviorism that would strive to be a kind of algorithmic hyper-performativity at the risk of also being hyper-entropic. Skip the next paragraph. But I would like to conclude by coming back to the question of the ubiquity of the screen, a ubiquity of the kind implied by Mark Weiser in 1991 when he reflected on ubiquitous computing in terms of technologies that disappear because they weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. Paul Valery foreshadowed this ubiquity in a remarkable way in 1928, precisely with respect to aesthetic technologies, and precisely in terms of physical, sensory, and noetic energetic processes with which we must constantly struggle, when he wrote, "Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images which will appear and disappear at a single movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. Just as we are accustomed, if not enslaved, to the various forms of energy that pour into our homes, we shall find it perfectly natural to receive the ultra-rapid variations or oscillations that our sense organs gather in and integrate to form all we know. I do not know whether a philosopher has ever dreamed of a company engaged in the home delivery of sensory reality." The conquest of ubiquity, dreamed of, that is, projected noetically by the philosopher in 1928, has today been accomplished, and the ultra-rapid variations of visual and auditory images has become the most quotidian medium and accompaniment of every sensory experience. To refer to the ubiquity of the screen is to suggest that screens have themselves become the milieu that is so perpetually and intimately close as to be virtually imperceptible, which is to say that, despite the rapidity of technological change, what we find difficult to see and therefore to think is the increase and transformation of this ubiquity, just as a fish in a pot of slowly heating water supposedly fails to perceive its own increasingly entropic situation. Probably I should have said lobster there. In such circumstances, perhaps only a quasi-phenomenological suspension is able to expose the milieu as such. For this reason, Hossein Darakhshan's observations in 2015 about our ubiquitous screenic milieu, after having served 6 years in prison, are worthy of our careful consideration. What he perceives to be the greatest transformation to have occurred in this interval is the increasing elimination of the web as a milieu of the hyperlinked contest of arguments, replaced instead by what he calls the stream, which we could also call the feed. A constantly updated, perpetually destabilizing river of information, along which we are borne, and that is increasingly composed of images and videos more than of text, and which corresponds precisely to Valerie's description of our being constantly and ultra-rapidly supplied with visual and auditory images. The stream now dominates the way people receive information on the web. Fewer users are directly checking dedicated web pages, instead getting fed by a never-ending flow of information that's picked for them by complex and secret algorithms. And not only do the algorithms behind the stream equate newness and popularity with importance, they also tend to show more of what we've already liked. Today, the stream is digital media's dominant form of organizing information. Maybe it's not the death of the hyperlink or the centralization exactly. Maybe it's that text itself is disappearing. But the stream, mobile applications, and moving images, they all show a departure from a book's internet toward a television internet. This is not the future of the web. This future is television. 3 elements of this analysis require clarification. The first is that this becoming television of the web is no longer a question of the hypersynchronization of mass broadcast, being instead the algorithmicization of television. But television is not cinema. If cinema is stretched between the poles of the televisual and the pornographic, then what is made clear by Dirac-Chan's analysis is that in this televisualized web, the cinematic finds itself stretched to the point of breaking, because this algorithmic televisualization amounts to the probabilistic destruction of the consistence of singularities, and therefore the destruction of the possibility of cinematic dreaming that is conditional upon the cultivation of interpretive practices that are always grounded in and dependent on having the time for the apprehension of consistencies. The second is that it is not exactly, as Dirac-Chan says, that text itself is disappearing. It is that text is succumbing to the stream, becoming less orthothetic, afflicted by the essential doubtfulness of the analogico-digital image, regressing to a more imagistic, evanescent form, marrying the emoticon. It is not just that our attentional capacities have been ravaged. It is that the word itself is declining in value and certainty, constantly being replaced by something else, just one more image to be consumed and discarded. This amounts to an effective decomposition of the distinction between literal tertiary retention and audiovisual tertiary retention, effected by digital tertiary retention. The orthotheticity of digital information, then, even though it fixes in the form of binary data all forms of information in the process of the general grammatization of everything, is nevertheless, and very paradoxically, now undermining the certainty and fixity of the word, folding it back into the cinematic temporality of the stream, as it decomposes the distinction between image and symbol in a way that amounts to the proletarianization of the word, the depletion of interpretive capacities, and a widespread increase in noetic entropy. The third is that what Dirac-Chan is describing is a contest between 2 tendencies engaged in a struggle for the future of the web. A war whose most powerful representatives are on the one hand Google and on the other hand Facebook. In other words, they're different. These 2 tendencies are a data behaviorism founded on algorithmically controlling access to web links and utilizing the data thereby accumulated to exploit and serve the behavioral interests of increasingly obsolescent consumerist capitalism, even while the stuff of Google's dreams and fantasies consists in seeing itself as driven by an engine of radical thinkers who are building not only the future, but the future's future, with all the entropic and neganthropic consequences that make Google so eminently pharmacological. And on the other hand, a data behaviorism founded on, as far as possible, destroying the web and corralling, in the case of Facebook, billions of users into the almost wholly entropic algorithmic television of the stream. The response to this immense struggle obviously ought not consist just in taking sides, even if it is clear that one of these tendencies is decidedly worse than the other. In itself, the struggle between these competing tendencies is a destructive and self-defeating war. Our responsibility can only be to strive to open a new path. The contemporary organology of dreams calls for a neganthropology of the cinematic for these 3 reasons. First, because the televisualization of the web amounts to the destruction of the right and possibility of dreaming, that is, of the possibility of any positive potential projection, whether noetic or otherwise. Second, because the folding of the word back into the image intensifies this destruction, disorientating our interpretive capacities by undermining any authenticity on which they could be based. And third, because it is not conceivable simply to let play out this struggle between the competing tendencies represented by Google's attempt to control the web and Facebook's attempt to replace it with algorithmic television. Together, these three reasons exacerbate the already immense difficulties in the contemporary Anthropocene of culting the negentropy as value of values. What Dirakshan calls the stream is a mechanism for ordering the massive availability of information, but in a way that tends to lead to the disordering and unavailability of knowledge. That is, it tends to greatly facilitate the increase of entropy and inhibit the accentuation of negentropy. As such, the stream is the very figure and ground, at the techno-aesthetic level, of the lack of metastability, making ours the epoch of the absence of epoch. It thwarts and short-circuits the fantasy and desire that the digital networks could become a new basis for the trans-individuation of desire and knowledge, without which responding to the challenges of the Anthropocene becomes unimaginable. If there is to be a new intergenerational alliance, as one of the conditions of the latest generations not being and not feeling that they are the last, then in the age of the ubiquitous screen, it has conditions that are undoubtedly not only aesthetic but cinematic. Perhaps the true age of television begins not with Skype but with the stream. And if so, it is in this context that we should hear the words with which Robert Kolker concludes A Cinema of Loneliness, when he evokes the possibility, which must be seen as a textual, analogico-digital responsibility that has for us fallen due, however improbably, of seeing beyond the prison that our contemporary cinema seems dead set on insisting we habit. This is the question of an autonomy that is not only ours. Thank you.